Hey everyone, it's another episode of What Happened, and as all you bounty hunters out there know, Nintendo's Metroid franchise is one of the most flawless in the entire galaxy, going decades without a single development problem, marketing issue, or suffering through a long period of silence. But on today's mission, we'll be focusing on what I believe to be one of the earliest examples of Samus Aran running into some malicious malfunctions during one of her most famous adventures, the one that placed you inside her armor. And get your head out of the gutter, please. Metroid Prime was one of the riskiest gambles Nintendo ever took with one of its classic series, taking a strictly 2D Japanese-made side-scroller which established the search-action genre deal with it, and then suddenly handing it over to a mostly inexperienced American studio, and entered the realm of the first-person shooter. First-person adventure. Now, while that certainly seems like a schematic for disaster, in a futile attempt to try and get ahead of the portion of you that'll look at the title of this video and go, "What? Metroid Prime is amazing! What the motherfucker?" So let me say it right now. Yes, Prime did go on to be one of the most critically lauded and fan-loved games in the entire series. It's just getting there was an especially bumpy ride. So strap on your various suit, load up your missiles, and flip on the appropriate visor. It's time to find out what happened with Metroid Prime. Unfortunately, there's really no way to start this story without talking about Jeff Spangenberg. But I'm still gonna try. During the trailblazing 3D days of the mighty Ultra 64, Nintendo adapted the most recognizable characters into the blustery, blurry world of polygons, but Metroid had always been mysteriously absent. The reason for this is varied and complex, but it all came down to everyone being a massive coward. Shigeru Miyamoto himself said that they lacked any concrete ideas, and Yoshio Sakamoto, director of Super Metroid, backed that up in an interview with Games TM. I was actually thinking about the possibility of making a Metroid game for N64, but I felt that I shouldn't be the one making the game. When I held the N64 controller in my hands, I just couldn't imagine how it could be used to move Samus around. With this, but okay. So for me, it was just too early to personally make a 3D Metroid at that time. Also, I know this isn't a direct answer to the question, but Nintendo had approached another company and asked them if they would make an N64 version of Metroid, and their response was that no, they could not. They turned it down, saying that unfortunately they didn't have the confidence to create an N64 Metroid game that can compare favorably with Super Metroid. That's something I take as a compliment to what we achieved. So yeah, as you can see, everyone is cowards. Now, if we take a look at that statement from another perspective, we'd see that it was possible Nintendo might never have released a Metroid game at all, or at least not until much later. That'll change in 1998 when, in a completely unrelated business deal, Nintendo inadvertently set the path for Samus's return. Well, not that return, another return. With the GameCube in the planning stages, they needed to secure more Western-style support, as they knew that's where the winds were a-blowin'. American and European studios were embracing 3D technologies and game design at a lightning-quick pace. So yeah, enter Mr. Spangenberg. I touched upon this waffle of a man in our The Guy Game episode, and even though it's going against my better judgment, I have to touch upon him again. Ugh. While he struck it big with the first Turok under Iguana Studios, he is quickly hoofed out of the company when Acclaim bought them out, albeit with a tidy severance package. With that capital, he established Retro Studios, but since this was the very early days, the company was being run out of his home. However, since both Acclaim and Iguana were chums with Nintendo during Turok's development, this gave him a bit of an inside track. Spangenberg had been the head of the developer that produced Turok, a Western-as-shit FPS for the Nintendo 64 that pushed its hardware limits early on. Nintendo, therefore, felt at that time Jeff was the ideal leader to head up a cutting-edge new studio. Oh, I have such
sights to show you."
The Japanese giant bankrolled the whole thing, investing millions into a massive 40,000 square foot space in Austin, Texas. This would include an opulent studio theater for presentations, trailers, and the like, as well as one of the state's first motion capture studios. To use all that square footage, though, you need employees, so the majority of the Turok team, well, they stayed with Iguana to keep making Turok, but Jeff did convince a few to come over with him. To shore up the numbers, he hired anyone else he could. Friends, college graduates, and even people who didn't make games at all. In fact, only a handful of staff members had ever shipped a game before. It was a motley crew for sure, but sometimes all you need is an experienced and reliable leader to get that team on the right track. But unfortunately, all they had was Jeff Spangenberg. With the money flowing and a massive space in which to work, it was decided by Jeff that Retro should launch into the development of 4 different games simultaneously, which was both a massive mistake, but yet, in a roundabout way, wound up saving the company. The 4 games in question were NFL Retro Football, which was a football game, a vehicular combat title by the name of Thunder Rally, action RPG Raven Blade,
"Ah, my sweet prince, you are too beautiful for this world,"
and finally, Action Adventure. Seriously, that's the only thing it's ever been called. Now, Dolphin dev kits didn't grow on trees, and while Nintendo did deliver on the one they had promised, that still didn't stop Jeff from launching these 4 different games, spread across 150 employees, and expecting them to share the one dev kit. So try not to be surprised when I now tell you that this made for a glacial pace in game development. The only thing these teams could do in the meantime was to try and approximate what was possible on the dev kit, but unfortunately Retro hadn't invested in any other technologies or engines by that point, and wouldn't do so for a long time still. That's because Spangenberg spent increasingly little time making video games at his video game business. He was more concerned with buying luxury cars, partying with babes, and burning through that Nintendo money as fast as it was coming in. Fast forward 2 years later, and not much had changed. None of the 4 games were on track to make the November 2001 launch of the GameCube. You know, the main thing the studio was founded to do. In an interview with Polygon, a former staffer at Retro who had been hired around this time recalled this phase of the company as truly baffling. I was like, "Oh, are you guys piecing the world together in hex parts?" And he said, "Nobody's told us how to build anything, so I'm just doing what seems to make sense." They, Retro, barely had a PC graphics engine running, no world editor, and no tools at all to speak of. As I hinted out before, a large portion of Retro's staff members actually came from the movie industry, working on CGI special effects in various films. So it was clear that the company was quickly spinning out of control, having already wasted so much time and money, but with very little to show for it. Its main decision maker, Spangenberg, was not even coming into the office at all by this point, ignoring the studio altogether as it was stuck spinning in a death spiral. Nintendo, having had enough of this bullshit, finally decided to fly over some of their higher-ups, Miyamoto included, to see just what was going on, and Retro was shitting themselves. The leads on each project were called in to separate meetings, and pretty much all of them got chewed out, as Nintendo were understandably upset that each game wasn't much more than a tech demo. Although internally it's been said that quite a lot of work was done on Raven Blade.
Oh no, it's so sad.
However, in a stroke of fate or luck or whatever you want to call it, Action Adventure, which featured 3 selectable spacefaring heroines, showed some promise. The sci-fi look and world that the team had produced was enough to convince Miyamoto that the company might be able to handle a Metroid game. But with Nintendo, of course, now closely monitoring the process, process from then on out. Thus, the 4 games were cancelled. Oh, my beautiful Raven Blade. And everyone was reassigned to focus on Metroid, which they needed to start from scratch. Lamentably, with all these cancellations, some jobs were made redundant, but no one's job was more redundant than good old Mr. Spangenberg. Around the same time, Nintendo caught wind of Sinful Summer, a softcore porn site of Jeff's own design, a design which used Retro's own online servers to host, which meant that Sinful Summer was paid for on Nintendo's coin. While that's bad enough, it gets worse. The actual content, photos and videos, which featured party animal Jeff and several women, were timestamped. Timestamped to regular middle-of-the-day working hours. That's when Nintendo politely informed Jeff that he would no longer be needed at the company. His shares were quickly bought out, he emptied his desk, which I'm sure was probably empty already, and Nintendo took full ownership of Retro Studios. Consequently, that's the last time anyone ever heard from the sleazy Spangenberg. Seriously, after the guy game, he just drops off the earth.
The galaxy is at peace.
As to who would run the company in his stead, well, that fell to Steve Barcia, with Mark Pacini being promoted to director of Metroid Prime. Now, even with Jeff's sacking, problems would plague Prime for a long while yet, especially with the incredible pressure now placed upon the studio. They had to deliver on this title, as it was their one chance to keep their doors open, as Nintendo wasn't playing around anymore. If Prime wasn't developed to their satisfaction or didn't perform at retail, then Retro would most likely be shut down. The first main issue that caused some friction was the perspective in which Samus's adventure would take place. Miyamoto had been mulling around the concept of a first-person Metroid for some while, and was of the opinion that it would be the best choice to support shooting and dodging enemies. Some leads, including Pacini, were against this, feeling that navigating levels with Metroid hallmarks like the Morph Ball was something that could only be conveyed in the third person. Regardless, Retro would need to figure all of this out and deliver milestones to Nintendo for approval, with each and every one being critical to the continuation of the project. Eventually, it was decided that since both companies couldn't see eye to eye on the perspective, a compromise was reached. The majority of the gameplay was going to be seen through Samus's visor, while other aspects like the Morph Ball would be viewed outside of it. Now, when you consider that for many on the team this was their first game, switching between two viewpoints on the fly and in a smooth way was going to be an ambitious and incredible trick to pull off, but they needed to do it. At the 2008 Montreal Video Game Summit, current Retro CEO Michael Kelbaugh and former director Mark Pacini detailed this stressful time trying to perfect the transition. We didn't want to make just another first-person shooter. Making a first-person shooter would have been a cheap and easy way to go, but making sure the themes and concepts in Metroid were kept was something that we wanted to do. And translating those things into 3D was a real challenge. Translating the Morph Ball was one of the hardest things to do. We used Super Metroid as our kind of Bible, but as we'd been sold on the concept of first person, we couldn't see how to put the ball into the title. In fact, it was actually on the chopping block for a long time. We thought that concentrating on the exploration through platforming might be good enough, but Miyamoto's first directive was, if we don't make the transition between the ball and first person seamless, then we can't do this game. It took us a few months to get that correct, and that was pretty scary. It was one of the first milestones we had to reach, and thanks to our engineers, we managed to create something that when Miyamoto saw it, he said, okay, on the project. That was huge. So while shooting and platforming were obviously integral to the game, there was one other issue Nintendo, more specifically Miyamoto, had with Metroid Prime, one that presented Retro with a serious noodle scratcher. Miyamoto's question to the designers was translated raw from Japanese to English, and its meaning was open to interpretation. In a podcast with Retro staffers, Brian Walker and Mike Wicken illuminated. Mike likes to tell a story about Mr. Miyamoto asking us during the early design phases of Prime 1, what would it be like if Samus had a bug's head? And at that time, I remember going back to our office and saying, switching heads? What does that have to do with Metroid? He wasn't asking if she had the head of a fly, he was asking about the mechanic of altered perception as a whole. And from that, the visor system came to be, when Samus could see different things with different visors and use that as a puzzle-solving element. This then, of course, also led to one of Prime's other most famous elements, progressing the narrative forward with the scan visor, which would give bits of lore or background info on creatures or objects. And as was just explained, there was a very real possibility that this elegant, optional component for fleshing out the game's world might never have even existed, if not for retro designers being able to parse that suggestion's meaning. Of course, during all of this, 2D Metroid purists scoffed at the idea of an untested American studio mucking things up with newfangled ideas and perspective switches ever since Prime's E3 2001 unveiling. At that time, it was seen as this impending, embarrassing disaster that would surely give the Metroid franchise a black eye. But no, that would come later. Maybe anticipating potential fan backlash, though, Nintendo also commissioned Yoshio Sakamoto and his team to develop a traditional Metroid adventure with fusion, and to quickly slap in some GameCube GBA connectivity, as was the style at the time. The link cable was never the style of any time. Once Prime was finally wrapped up, the team took a long vacation to recover from all the stress and crunch they had to endure to pull off, and let's call it what it was, a miracle. To both drastically change yet stay true to the spirit of a highly regarded franchise in a slick and modern package was and still is a rarity. Once the Gold Master was shipped to Nintendo for manufacturing, everyone just kinda put the project out of their mind as they decompressed. When the staff returned, they were thrilled and kinda shocked to see just how successful Metroid Prime came to be. It sold over 2 million copies and powerbombed into various outlets Game of the Year front runners. Nintendo was immensely pleased with the results as well, and immediately commissioned Retro to follow up with a sequel, leveraging ideas they had originally drafted up for Prime 1 but didn't have time to include, like multiplayer. This mode would famously debut in Metroid Prime 2 Echoes to somewhat of a divisive response, but its DNA would go on to exist in future projects. Ever since then, the Prime series has influenced Metroid in one way or another, which is definitely something that almost no one could have predicted when the game was first revealed 20 years ago now? Damn. Many key members of the Prime team would eventually leave the company and move on to other things, but through it all, Nintendo and Retro's relationship never diminished. Instead, it only strengthened. They would contribute to Mario Kart, they would relaunch Donkey Kong like twice, and for a time they even worked on a Sheikah-focused Legend of Zelda spin-off title that, while never released, showed just how ingrained and committed they are to Nintendo franchises. Obviously, while we haven't had any official news about Metroid Prime 4 for over, what are we at now? Some 800 days, Retro seems to excel in launching polished, fully formed experiences, oftentimes out of nowhere. So whatever it is they're cooking up, odds are that it'll be worth waiting for. Everyone working hard at Retro right now, don't stress yourselves too much. We'll see you next mission. If you know of any other intergalactic incidents involving insectoids, I lost it, damn it, then send me a transmission in the comments below, over on my Twitter, or set your coordinates for the Flophouse VIP Patreon and become a big boss and nominate the game or movie you'd like to see in a future episode. See you next time, and thanks for watching.